On the 9th of December 1783, outside of Newgate Prison in London, the first execution using what was known as a new drop gallows was carried out, outside the place of incarceration. Newgate was the site of many executions, and the first victims of this new structure were 9 men and 1 woman, who were executed simultaneously for a number of different crimes by executioners William Brunskill and Edward Dennis. This gallows was on wheels and would be brought out for each execution by a team of horses who dragged it in front of the large crowd. Throughout history there are many different variations of hanging executions. For example, at the end of the Second World War, inside Czech lands and Hungary, a number of prominent war criminals were executed by pole hanging. With this there was no gallows, just a post where victims were condemned on, and this was also performed in public. The most trustworthy thing to avoid a botched execution at the time was using a skilled executioner, not necessarily the equipment he was given. But inside of Britain there were some hangmen who had condemned thousands. But what was the new drop, and what made it an execution method that cemented its place in history? Welcome to the Fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. It was claimed that the first recorded use of the new drop gallows was at Tyburn, the infamous site of the Tyburn tree, the triangular gallows, that could condemn many people at once. The gallows here was aimed to slowly strangle a prisoner, as during the proceedings a rope was passed over the wooden beams of the triangular structure. For centuries before in Britain, death by hanging usually meant an executioner strangling the life out of someone, but the new drop offered a different method of execution, with the prisoner plunging to their death through a drop. Death was usually at this time still carried out by asphyxiation as it was before, but instead of an executioner choking the life out of someone, the drop was what tightened the noose, and then someone was strangled as their body weight tightened the rope. Death could take place after a number of minutes, and people were still known to have moved. Some prisoners went limp straight after the drop, but did not suffer much at all. But the first new drop scaffold that emerged at Tyburn was one that was covered in black material, and it had a small flight of stairs for the condemned to access the platform by. There were 2 upright beams from the scaffold and a crossbeam completing it, and under the beam was a small box, which was just over 3 feet tall. This was designed to fall into the scaffold, and then leave the condemned suspended by their neck. For this first execution there were even some black cushions brought, and it was Earl Ferrers who lost his life on the device. He was allowed some time to pray before the execution with his priest, and just after midday the execution was performed, and this did not go very well, as the mechanism malfunctioned, leaving Earl Ferrers' feet on the platform. For some time he struggled, but he then went still. But despite the teething problems, the new drop gallows was adopted by many different prisons and authorities, and there were other gallows which replaced the outdated cart and gallows, where someone was taken on the back of a cart, and then the noose was secured around their neck, and the cart was then driven off. The gallows of Newgate Prison had a number of different features, such as wooden boards, which would hide the legs and lower body of the condemned, as they struggled when the drop was released. These gallows were usually created on the top of gatehouse roofs of county jails, and the procession of the dead on the back of a cart became a thing of the past. There were between 1783 and 1874 1,120 people who were executed using short drop hanging on the new drop gallows at Newgate Prison, and some prisons even had more secluded execution structures away from the eyes of the public. Following the passing of the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, all executions had to take place within the walls of county prisons, and the existing gallows was used and was set up inside of prison yards, away from the eyes of the public. Some prisons had execution sheds erected in the exercise yards to carry out these executions, and usually the trapdoor was created over a pit. Later the long drop would be used, and this pit would be dug deeper to allow a prisoner to fall a longer distance through the gallows. But having the gallows in a separate building away from other prisoners allowed the guards to carry out the proceedings away from the sounds of other prisoners, as there would be a large crack from the opening of the trapdoor which could audibly be heard throughout the prison. At Newgate, the gallows beam that emerged was wide enough to be able to accommodate 4 prisoners side by side, and then a new gallows in 1881 was created with 2 uprights and then a crossbeam. There were in the crossbeam iron bands in the centre fixed, and then a number of chains dangled from this, and the rope was attached to it above the trapdoor. There was a pulley also for the trapdoor, which was operated on the platform by a lever, which could be pushed, and there were bales of cotton piled up to muffle the noises. Before 1884, different counties were responsible for providing the gallows for being able to carry out death sentences in their county, and there were many different designs and each had different quirks. But then the standard gallows emerged, and this was what was used across the nation, and the beam of this was long enough to execute 3 prisoners side by side, and the trapdoors were made from 3-inch thick oak, which was released from the floor of the execution chamber, and these improvements to the design made executions quicker. The short drop method, as it became known, was used up until the later 1800s, and the final woman to be executed in this manner was Mary Ann Barry at Gloucester in January 1874. She struggled for 3 minutes after the drop fell. The protocols for the executions using the new drop at Newgate were recorded and published, and these were the first written execution procedures. It was stated that the 120 constables be summoned to attend, that proper posts and rails be fixed to prevent any carriages coming up and down the Old Bailey, each prisoner to give notice in writing to the sheriff prior to the day of execution of the name of one friend to be admitted to him, the time of execution to be precisely 9 o'clock, the sheriff's officers to be summoned to attend in their gowns and with javelins, the execution to take place as soon after the prisoner comes up to the scaffold, as the nature and decorum of the awful scene will admit, the scaffold and passage to be completely fixed by 8 o'clock and not later, that the friends of each culprit do send a shell, open coffin, to Newgate at 7 o'clock in the evening of the day preceding the execution, constables to attend the then removal of the scaffold. The following regulations are to be observed on the day of execution: the sheriff's officers 20 in number, with their javelins, within the first railing of the scaffold, 4 without javelins to halter, noose and bring out the criminals. The constables, under the direction of the city marshals, are to be placed in close order around the outer rail to preserve the peace and permit no person within them. Of course, later drop executions became the norm all around the world, with different gallows being created, and also different executioners making tweaks as to how they perform the procedures on the structure. The new drop was the first pioneering drop gallows, and this would be used for centuries inside of different countries, and would take the lives of some of history's most ruthless criminals. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.